Welcome to this month's bonus episode of Rite Gud. In this edition of the book club, we're looking at Alfred Bester's The Demolished Cat. Excuse me, Harley. That is The Demolished Man, winner of the first Hugo Award. Joining us is Stephen Mazur, former assistant editor of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and Kurt Schiller, editor-in-chief of Blood Knife Magazine. Both of you guys were psyched to talk about this book. So what is it about the book that you both love so much?
Sex, telepaths, guns, people smoking all the time and going, you got a good pair of shoulders on you, Dane. And so, no, I read this. This was one of the 2 or 3 books that got me interested in the pulp era of sci-fi, and I stumbled upon it in a used bookstore in like halfway through college when I was kind of like I had gotten tired of reading all the stuff that I read when I was a teenager, and I was like, all right, well, let's see what else is out there. And I actually think I read The Star's My Destination, Bester's other really well-known novel, first, and then I immediately went and read this one. So it was a very formative novel for me, and I think ever since then it's both dramatically influenced the way that I like see and understand sci-fi, and also kind of the way that I think about like influences, because there's so much in this that just keeps like resurfacing and resurfacing and resurfacing in different media. So plus I think it's just it's a ripping yarn. So
Yeah, it's a really fun book.
I read it later in life. I didn't read this until 2019. But, I knew about it from working at FNSF. Gordon would mention Alfred Bester. John Joseph Adams, I think, has said on numerous public occasions that his favorite SF novel is, like Kurt said, Bester's other great novel, The Star's My Destination. And I also read Star's My Destination first, probably about 10 years ago. Thought it was really cool. And then just, I had it on my shelf, and one day I was like, well, let's see what Demolished Man is like. And I don't know, I'm not sure which one I like best, but reading it again, it's such a good book. I mean, it's a masterful debut. I was afraid that I wouldn't finish this in time for the episode, because I'm a lot busier now than I was in 2019, but I managed to read it in exactly the same amount of time that I did before I had a kid, which was 4 days. I got through it in 4 days.
Yeah, it's a quick read.
Yeah, I really love how packed it is. It is just so packed with plot and character and all sorts of SFNal ideas, but it's also incredibly slim. It's only like 240 pages long, and it's so propulsive. It goes, and it keeps going, and it never lets up, and I just feel like people don't know how to write like this anymore.
Yeah.
I think part of it might be that like where Bester was coming from when he wrote this was basically coming out of like a couple decades of writing like radio serials. Like he very much
I can see that.
Yeah, like big chunks of his career was writing like noir and mystery murder, like 1940s radio shows where it's all, it's just dialogue. And I think that probably really comes through in this novel, which is like, I had forgotten how dialogue heavy it is. And it's like well written, well characterized dialogue, but it definitely has that kind of like detective show cadence. Like I could almost hear people like making footstep sounds and like thunder crash sounds in the background with like a big sheet of metal. That's how I was reading this.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
It's really interesting to think of, we think of Bester as like, he was a science fiction writer. He wrote 2 of the greatest science fiction novels that, the field has ever produced, which is true. But from his point of view, science fiction was pretty much always like a fun hobby for him. His real career was in like actual entertainment. He broke in to writing through the pulps. I think he started off at Thrilling Wonder magazine, and he wrote stories there for a few years. But then the editors of Thrilling Wonder, I think their names were Mort Weisinger and Jack Schiff. They jumped from Thrilling Wonder stories to the comics industry. I forget which one. It might have been DC, or
it was DC,
what later became DC. Right, and they took Bester with him, So that's how he broke into writing for the comics, and he wrote for the comics for several years. He wrote for Captain Marvel, the Green Lantern, Star-Spangled Kid. He might have written for Superman. I've seen things where somebody said that he wrote for Superman, but then I think he might have also said that he never wrote for Superman. And then from comics, he got into radio. From radio, he got into television. From that, he started working as a features writer for Holiday magazine, which was this big, important slick back in like the 60s and 70s. It was a sister magazine to the Saturday Evening Post. So his job in entertainment was capital E entertainment. I think it's a really great, Kurt, what you were saying before about how the writing in this book is influenced by his time in radio and comics, and I just love how cinematic the writing in The Demolished Man is. You know, something that Raquel, other episodes of this podcast that you've touched on before is that how like a lot of bad SF writing just feels like it's a bad movie script, or it reads like the writer just had like a TV show going on in their head, and they're just mechanically describing to you what's happening on their imagined television screen, and like that's all bad cinematic writing. But this is great cinematic writing, especially Chapter 8, when Ben Reich and Lincoln Powell are both hunting for Barbara DeCourtney. All those quick, choppy little scenes. It's like quick cuts in a TV show, but it's just done for such great effect. It works as a novel, and I love it.
Yeah, and I can see that there are almost, I'm not sure what else to call them, but set pieces, but some really interesting settings. The game of sardines in that rich lady's house that is identical to the old Penn Station, that like crazy psychedelic melted chemical factory where the psychic has her whole like psychic show, and then strip club review, just all these, the Spaceland. I fucking love Spaceland. I loved Spaceland.
Spaceland is great.
Spaceland rules.
I love Spaceland.
Yeah, it's fun. It's very lean, this book, in that it's like I have these crazy ideas. I want to show you something. I want to show you something big and crazy and ridiculous. I want to show you this weird melted psychedelic psychic. I want to show you this weird space theme park. I want to show you all these things. Let's go. Let's fucking go for it. And it just keeps going for it, and it's got this real fun energy to it. And I think what I love about this story is what I love about a lot of older sci-fi pulp, which is that there's no actual science in the science fiction, and frankly the story is better for it. Science fiction is best when there's no legitimate science in it. There's zero legitimate science in this novel. Thank fucking God. It rocks.
Yeah, this novel does a lot of what I really it's like a hallmark of this era of science fiction, like before, because this is really right on the cusp of when like what we would consider modern hard sci-fi really started to take over. So this is kind of like on the tail end of that pulp era, and they kind of coexisted for a little while. That much more like engineering fiction type thing, but more like Cold Equations, where it's very like, well, what's the science? Let's talk about the mass. But this type of sci-fi does this thing all the time where it'll mention a name. It's a harmonic gun, and everyone runs around in a panic, and then about 2 paragraphs later you get about 3 sentences that explain what a harmonic gun is, and then it just never comes up again, and they just move on.
And it never tells us how it works, because it doesn't. It's bullshit. It doesn't matter.
You can't touch
just
the floor.
Don't touch the floor or your goo,
up.
and that's all. That's all I need to know. That's perfect.
The floor is lava.
That's all exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's all I need to know. That's all I want to know. I'm happy. So before we dive in, maybe we should talk about, just give a brief synopsis of the novel for those who haven't read it. I guess, take it easy, cat. But this, The Demolished Cat. But this is a novel that takes place in future New York City, and it's a murder mystery set in a future in which there has been no murder for 70 years, because society is sort of kept in check by psychic civil servants, mind readers, called espers, or sometimes called peepers as slang, which is such a funny slang word, which I really like.
That annoyed so many contemporary like now, not contemporary to when it came out. I looked through like a handful of like modern reviews of it, and a lot of people are like, I can't stand all the 1950s stuff like peepers, and I love
it.
Yeah,
I love
great.
the campiness of the slang. I love that everybody talks like some sort of 1950s person. It's so much fun. I love the bad 1950s Freudian psychoanalysis, too. It rocks. It's so bad.
It must have been in the water. It's just all over this book, and I feel like it's all like hardly anybody talked about back then. You know, you have an Oedipal complex, so your Jungian archetype is out of whack.
I watched a bunch of or read a couple of interviews with Bester. There's a really entertaining one on YouTube. I think it's the 1972 Worldcon, where he just kind of like shows up and he just...
Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, 76. He just sits there like smoking a cigarette, just kind of like telling stories and like shooting the shit.
Nice.
And one of the things he says is that he liked Jungian and Freudian stuff because it was a good like tool to play with while making a story. And he didn't seem super invested in it personally, so I think it's kind of an open question whether it's something he believed in or whether he just thought it was something fun to like to use in stories. But yeah, there's definitely was something in the water in general, and I think a big part of it is the same thing that you see in the Foundation books by Asimov, where it's this idea that, like, well, we've unlocked the hard sciences. You know, now we have harnessed the power of science to build industry and technology. And there was this assumption, I think, around this era in like the 40s and 50s, that the same thing was going to happen with psychology and the social sciences, and that within 20 or 30 years, we'd be able to predict and model alter the behavior of the human mind and society and culture. And clearly it didn't exactly play out like that, but like, you know, this is the era, and this shows up in the story too, when like the modern discipline of marketing was being created, and this idea of like marketing altering people's minds and behaviors. And so I think it was, you know, it was something that was a genuine like social concern and idea at the same time, as well as fertile ground for fiction.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of social commentary in this book in sort of a fun way. It is very Mad Men in some ways. It's very like Consumerland. Look at this weird... I mean, like, advertising and rich and wealth play a huge role in this. There's a whole bit about an advertising jingle. The guy uses a really obnoxious earworm of an advertising jingle in order to, like, put up a mental block to keep the psychics from reading his mind. Because he just keeps, like, humming this really irritating song, and that's all they're getting out of him.
Such a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's just great. It's brilliant.
I think that a lot of that benefits from the fact that there wasn't a like pop cultural idea of what does it mean to be a telepath. Here and now, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of movies and TV shows about people with, you know, telepathy. There's Professor X. There's these comic book characters. There's movies. Blah blah blah. Like, if you say a telepath, people immediately have an idea of like what that means, what it looks like. You're imagining someone like touching their hand to their forehead and squinting. And Bester, you know, was writing at a time when that wasn't so much of a pop culture thing, and so he has a much more open canvas, and he's just kind of throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. And what he winds up doing is kind of saying, okay, well, what if there was a society where there were telepaths everywhere? What would that look like? And, you know, he's not really trying to do super serious, like, social modeling or anything, but I think he does a good job of, you know, integrating it. Like, what would a lawyer do? Well, obviously, your lawyer would have to be a telepath to know if the other guy's telepathic lawyer was spying on you. So, obviously, all of the, like, professional careers are going to be held by telepaths and so on. And so he kind of is, he's able to reason from like first principles in a way that I think modern writers struggle to, because first you have to get away from like the kind of like tried and true pop culture cliche that everybody already has access to, because nobody wants to read that an 800th time.
Let's talk a little bit about the way he portrays psychic reading and psychic thought using some kind of interesting text formatting. If you've read House of Leaves, you're familiar with how the writer might use text on the page and the way it's formatted to show ideas falling. And in this one, he uses text formatting to show people's ideas overlapping as a bunch of psychics go to a dinner party to have a discussion, like their thoughts sort of wrap together and intersect and bounce off of each other. I love the bit where they're playing a mind game where they each get like a psychic sentence and they're supposed to weave them together into a grid. And there's a lot of these really great little touches in there. And something I thought that was kind of fun and kind of charming is that there's a lot of uses of special characters in people's names. A little bit like screen names. Like there's someone named like Wygand, and the "and" is like an ampersand.
Atkins.
So that,
Atkins.
yeah, that's one of 2 or 3 things that I wonder if William Gibson didn't just take directly. Because I know that he's a big fan of Bester, and he's a big fan of this book, and The Stars My Destination has talked about it influencing his kind of ideas of cyberpunk when he was writing Neuromancer. And there's similar things. There's a character named 3Jane, for instance. There's also an orbital space station that's filled with rich people that they've kind of cobbled together. There's a lot of ideas that appear in both works, and yeah, I love the use of like special characters. And it's funny because, as you say, Raquel, this is like more Mad Men than it is Mad Max. so like, you know, he's thinking of like typewriters. There is a computer that prominently appears.
Yeah, Mo.
But like, it feels much more like it's informed by telephones and typewriters than it is by, you know, computers and fax machines.
Yeah, I keep thinking there's that character on Mad Men who ended up, I think, with an eye patch who secretly wrote sci-fi on the side. I'm thinking, like, this is the book he would write.
Yeah.
This is the book that guy would write. I love it. I love how the author briefly admits that, like, yeah, the space lens layout makes no sense. Fuck it, it looks cool. Just roll with it, okay, guys? I know. Before we had a CinemaSins guy to make ding sounds and say, why is it like that? Why isn't it an orb? He's just like, it looks cooler this way. Fuck you.
One of the things that I think is also kind of just done just because it's cool is that almost all of the characters have some kind of weird mental complication. Lincoln Powell, who is our kind of heroic detective, I'm curious about how heroic he was meant to read at the time, because I think, you know, to modern readers, he also reads like a sleazeball. But he has this thing called Dishonest Abe, where he suddenly feels a compulsion to just, like, make shit up, and he kind of blames it on, like, how smart he is, kind of. He's like, well, I'm so smart that, like, I can't help myself. I just start making up lies. And it's funny because it's very much like Principal Skinner in the Steamed Hams sketch, where he just starts saying things that are, like, kind of plausible, and people will ask him, like, wait, really? And he goes, never mind, I'll tell you about it later. Like, at one point, he claims that, like, all telepaths use the opposite hand they should or something, or he's like, they all behave as if they're left-handed or something. It's just, like, a weird random thing. There's a recurring thing of characters in this being self-defeating.
Oh, yeah.
Where, like, Reich, you know, is done in by himself. Lincoln Powell has kind of, you know, a dark version of himself. Everybody has their weird vices. I really like the Gilt Corpse, she's called, or the Gilded Corpse.
Yeah.
I forget her name, but she's like a rich socialite, and she constantly throws like nude parties and tries to like shack up with people and is just like flirting constantly and super horny all the time. Apparently the style at her parties is to wear ultraviolet treated clothing so that when they turn the lights off and turn on like the special lights, everybody's clothing disappears.
Maria Beaumont.
Maria, thank you, yes.
Who calls everybody darling. This very, very over-the-top socialite character, but it somehow works just because of how... It's like, yeah, we're going over the top. Fuck it, let's do it. Darlings, I have a simply divine game we must play.
I wonder how much of that, what you said, the characters having self-defeating mental complications, comes from Bester himself, because it seems to me like there's quite a bit of him on the page. Having watched that Mid-Americon interview, he's, you know, some people are different from the way you'd think they would be, and then some people turn out to be like exactly how you'd think they would be, and he seems exactly like the kind of guy who would write this and The Stars My Destination, but, you know, just very animated. He's always on. But speaking about Maria Beaumont, one of the things that I'd forgotten about this book from the first time I read it is that, especially for, when it was written in, I guess probably like 1951, because it was serialized in early 1952 in Galaxy, is just how sexy the book is. And like kind of kinky. Like there, it's like not always that explicit, but there's also a lot going on. Like, like you said, like...
Oh, it is a very horny book. Everybody's
very horny
book.
That's what I'm trying to say. It's a very horny, kinky book, especially for being like 73 years old.
The fucking the romantic subplot is like mind control age play.
Didn't I tell you it was
That's
bonkers?
very strange.
My God, let's talk about the age play romantic subplot, because holy shit, this is the most like, here is the author's thinly veiled fetish. Right? So he falls in love.
Yeah, that's a weird one. That's a really weird one.
With the daughter of the murder victim, and for totally legitimate reasons, the therapy to help her get over her trauma is to turn her into an adult baby. And then have her become an adult toddler, and then he, for our hero, for also completely legitimate reasons that are very necessary, decides she's gonna live in my house
and call him
and
daddy
call me
also,
daddy,
or,
and
Papa,
this girl
Papa,
that likes me is gonna take care of her. Okay.
And then at the end they're dating.
And now we're dating, and she's like, look, and there's the dialogue that's basically, you were a toddler a week ago, and I'm like, oh, okay, this book, all right, buddy.
I gotta say that, like, in addition to it being completely bonkers, it's also really funny, though, to imagine this grown woman going just acting like a baby, and then acting like a toddler, and then, like, the phase towards the end of the book where she's, like, acting like an insecure teenager is just so funny to me.
I will say, I feel like, especially in Bester's, like, early writing, he has a tendency to fall into very clear-cut, like, noir, hard-boiled crime fiction dame, tropes, or cliches, if you will.
Yeah.
Where every woman is either an elderly rich woman, they are a wealthy tramp, they are a less wealthy tramp. They're like a mall. Like, what's her name? Duffy?
Oh, yeah.
Or they're like a helpless, innocent baby who's in trouble in some way, who's caught up in intrigue. Sometimes a literal baby, as it turns out. But he does much the same thing in a lot of his other writing around the same time. And I have to question how much of that is trying to do something on purpose and how much of it is just like, this is how I write women.
I mean, this is 1950s, so... I am willing to accept the premise that a man writing in the 1950s had questionable views about women.
Yeah. Look how progressive I am. She lives by herself. She's not married. Yeah. I especially, speaking of, like, the horniness, it is funny that Maria Beaumont faxes him a nude picture of herself. Oh, yeah. I just want to call attention to that.
She rocks.
Specifically.
Good for her.
The central murder, part of the plan, which the plan is absurdly complicated. It is perhaps more complicated than it needed to be. I will say, part of it involves convincing this horny socialite to organize a nude party game. And our villain, Ben Reich, accomplishes this by buying an ancient book of party games, destroying most of the book except for one game called Sardine, which involves everybody taking off their clothes and getting into a closet.
Well, that's not the normal way to play Sardines.
Right,
the normal way is just like hide and
yeah.
seek, but, Maria Beaumont's like, no, we're doing horny Sardines. We're gonna do it.
But, like, as Ben Reich is on his way to murder his business rival, something de Courtney, I forget his first name is weird, it's like Kiri or Kyrai or something like that. Yes, that sounds right. He's literally described as stepping over an octopus of, grasping flesh, of like people just like rolling around on the floor having sex. Or he gets into a closet and there's like a nude woman in there and she's like, oh, hello. And she feels that he's all dressed and she's all pissed off because he's dressed.
Yeah.
The sexuality is written in a slightly evasive way. Like, it's pretty clear what's going on, but it's not, for the most part, coming right out and saying things. But I was surprised at especially the description of Maria Beaumont. Basically, I think she's already topless when he gets to the party, and it describes her as like trying to grab his hand and like put it into her cleavage.
Yep.
Yeah. I love the joke that he makes when they meet at the party, Ben Reich and Maria Beaumont, and they're hugging, and she says, "Oh, darling, it's just too much." Ben Reich whispers into her ear, "It's too plastic." Brutal.
Yeah, what a jerk. Ben, rude.
The depictions of wealthy high society and the Esper Society, I think, are some of my favorite parts in the novel. Like, the whole sequence at the kind of high society orgy party, I think it will feel familiar to anyone who's read science fiction featuring, like decadent rich people. They're either shallow or maniacal or self-obsessed, or they're all portrayed as, like, broken. Like, the rich in this world all seem to be broken.
Mm-hmm.
Either because they are literally old and decrepit, or because they are megalomaniacs like Ben Reich.
Ben Reich.
There's a lot of stuff that feels very relevant. For instance, when Reich goes to see Duffy, who is the songwriter who gives him the irritating earworm, he mentions that she did work for him in the past writing like a strike-breaking song.
Oh, right.
There's a lot in here about like labor and politics. I think something that a lot of people who look at the 50s with nostalgia don't realize is that people in the 50s also recognized that this sort of consumeristic lifestyle was really superficial and soulless. Like, so much art from that era is about, yeah, okay, I live in a nice house in the suburbs, but I feel like I'm dying inside. So a lot of that comes back into the book, and I'm just thinking about how fucking weird it must have been if, like, okay, to come back from World War II, you liberate a concentration camp, you storm the beach or whatever, and now it's like, okay, let's watch TV and go to the mall, I guess, and I'm supposed to just, like... feel like this is enough. All right. And a lot of people did not feel like that was enough. A lot of people did feel like this is weird. This doesn't make sense. This isn't real. None of this is real. What the fuck? And a lot of that kind of comes through in this book. But something that was so interesting is that the psychics, they have a guild, a sort of labor union type professional organization that has very strict rules about like ethics and how you're allowed to use your gift, and there are very strict punishments doled out to people who misuse that gift. And there's also eugenics in it, which is not really questioned. You are required to marry another Esper and like have a kid, or else fuck you, I guess. Mm-hmm. And it's a big feature of our sort of hero in that he's unmarried, and a lot of psychic women, of course, are throwing themselves at him. Because, of course they are. He's the hero.
He's the most eligible bachelor in the
He's the
guild.
most eligible bachelor, and he's just like, no, I'm not into it. I'm not marriage shy. If only I could meet a weird, rich baby woman toddler.
Yeah, I must say, the Esper Guild is not a very good union.
No, it's terrible.
We are told that Augustus Tate, who is the Esper that Ben Reich hires to kind of help him pull off the murder. So, first of all, he's a member of an extreme right-wing political group within the guild called the League of Esper Patriots.
I can't believe this wasn't written 2 years ago.
I know, God, they have this whole, and it's funded in part by Ben Reich. It's like this astroturfed political right-wing movement.
And all they want is to not pay taxes.
That's it. Literally, that's all they want is to not pay taxes, and I think to cut back on some of the ethical rules and stuff, I think, was another part of it.
Right, because you have to give 95% of your income to the guild. Apparently.
I was wondering if that was a comment on the sort of the really high marginal tax rates of the 1950s or something. Like,
that's possible.
It used to be a rule where for every dollar you made over, I forget what the top rate was. It was like $10 million a year, but for every dollar over that you made, you had to pay some insane, like 75 to 90% of it. Like, super high taxes.
Obviously, we're talking about the U.S. and not the U.K., but that is the literal subject of the Beatles song, The Taxman. That is the one for you, or one for me, 19 for you. That is that's the 95% that they're talking about there. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. It would make sense. Bester is also very much a fuck you, pay me type person, so I can definitely see him being pissed off about anything that takes money out of his hand. The other thing that we find out, though, speaking of like modern political overtones, is that Ben Reich also funds an anti-Esper smear campaign to increase discrimination against Espers. So he's simultaneously funding like an extremist Esper rights movement and also like an anti-Esper reactionary smear campaign.
And meanwhile, he employs some of the best Espers around because he's rich. He's got an Esper psychiatrist, an Esper this, and Esper that. He's just surrounded by Espers. There's a bit around the end of the book where the guild basically says, "You guys got to leave this fucking guy, or else you're out of the guild. You're gonna face some serious shunning if you don't do what we say." And he's just like completely fucked.
Mm-hmm. I think the inclination in a lot of stories like this is to say, okay, well, the telepaths are the ones who are in charge now. They have powers and abilities that nobody else does. But it's explicitly, first of all, indicated that, A, there's like prejudice against Espers, which it kind of makes sense. If you couldn't read minds and you knew a bunch of people around you could read your mind, you can understand there being some tension there. And so the way that the guild maintains power is by at least nominally protecting them from the prejudice against them and kind of uniting them as like a power block. But the telepaths are very much not the ones who are in control. It's rich non-telepaths who are in control, and they have hired all the telepaths to basically serve their every whim. Ben Reich has a therapist who's on call 24/7, who he jumps out of bed at like 3 a.m. and goes to get psychoanalyzed. He's got like a bunch of like accountants and secretaries who follow him around, and the reason that he wants them to be telepaths isn't even so that they can use their telepathy to do telepath stuff, but literally so that his every whim can be catered to without him needing to tell someone. So like he gets home, they immediately know, oh, he wants dinner right away. He wants you to cancel his appointments tomorrow. It's literally, and I think it makes sense. And it reflects like a supernatural ability effectively as like a labor issue of like, okay, well, this is a valuable skill. In fact, it's even stated by one of the characters that extrasensory perception is not a miracle, but a skill subject to wage hour limitations.
It's emotional labor.
Yeah.
Kurt, I think, you know, what you've been talking about, it really ties in with what you were saying earlier about Bester not having to labor under the preconceived notions of what a telepath is or what they can do or what it would mean if you're going to write that story. Because I think part of why the novel is so compelling and so entertaining is, you know, like you said, even though there's many telepaths out there in society, you would think they're in control, but they're not the top heap. You know, at best, they're salaried professionals like doctors or lawyers. And I just feel like a lot of other writers who try to write telepaths would just make the same sort of, you know, they're just say, oh, well, they have mind control powers, so, like, they'd be in charge, right? You know, something that, like you said, the book goes out of its way to point out that, like, no, probably not. They would probably just be like regular old people who have this interesting skill, but they would still be, you know, subject to the demands of, you know, the people who have the real wealth and power in society. And it makes for a much more interesting book than just mind power kings.
They're sort of intellectuals, I guess.
You know what? That's probably why they're not in charge. They're all just a bunch of eggheads.
They're a bunch of goddamn nerds.
Yeah.
We see this telepath party first that Raquel was talking about earlier with like the interestingly laid out text where it kind of shows all their conversations crisscrossing. And one of the things that really reminded me of is it made me regard the telepaths as being kind of like Ivy League graduates. Like they're all very snobby. They're all like, well, whose son is that? Whose nephew is that? Whose niece is that? Oh, well, he's going to get this internship because his uncle is in charge of such and such company. He's going to go here. Or at one point, Lincoln Powell, he sees a second-class Esper kind of like being rude to his third-class fiance or girlfriend, and he kind of like dresses him down by calling him effectively like new money almost. He's like, oh, he's like a second come lately in the where I guess like he's finally reached like high Esper society, and so he thinks he's like hot shit. And the other Espers who are much more skilled and powerful than him are like, yeah, shut the fuck up, buddy, and sit down. Mind your manners. You're in high society here. Real men are talking real business now. Please leave that nonsense out for the normies out on the street. But they come across as, like upwardly mobile, educated careerists, essentially. And they're not in charge, but they're the most in charge of the people who aren't in charge. They're PMC, effectively.
Yeah. And it's also the Esper Party is, I feel, draws a sharp contrast between, they're sort of, like you said, Ivy League, buttoned up, sort of upwardly mobile, ethics-based class, and, Maria Beaumont's wealthy, degenerate sex bacchanal.
I gotta say, I know which party I'm going to. I'm just saying.
I know which party I wish I were cool enough to go to, but I'd probably just be chit-chatting like, oh, so-and-so got into telepath Harvard. Good for you.
The other thing that I like is that the really wealthy people that we see, it's not really clear what their companies do apart from just like business stuff. Ben Reich's company seems to make weapons, weird science stuff. They just kind of do whatever. They just seem to be a giant conglomerate. The only power that can challenge them is another giant conglomerate, but it's not like Ben Reich does business deals all day. He mostly runs around being psychoanalyzed and having like manic episodes.
That's kind of what I imagine Elon Musk does during the day when he's not posting himself into another divorce.
I think Elon Musk would totally convince himself that he could be the first man to commit murder in 70 years. I think he would just also go around telling everyone.
Yeah, Grimes, make a song that gets stuck in my head. Grimes!
Tweeting, I think I might have just gotten away with murder.
But murder is in, quotation
And he
marks.
decides on his victim based on the whims of some, weird fucking anime Nazi. Just, you should kill that guy. He's an SJW. God.
Speaking of that, there is a great part where Ben Reich realizes... The whole reason for the murder plot is, I think, the one part of the book that I agree with some of the critics that is a bit weak, which is that Ben Reich, misunderstands a code where he offers DeCourtney a merger between their two companies for equal shares. And he sends it in this corporate code, which is only available to basically CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. They have a special code that they use to communicate with. But it's it seems to be a well-known code that everyone has access to. And he's waiting for a response, and he gets it, and it's the response for deal accepted. Let's merge our companies. And he sees it and goes, he rejected me. And it's never really explained apart from just, him being off or having a weird, a psychotic episode for why he thinks it was rejected. And it is kind of, I feel like it could have been a little less convenient to start this.
Oh, really? I kind of disagree. I think it works really well.
Well, we have nothing to say to each other then.
I'll log off. No, well, because a big theme of the novel is self-knowledge, knowing yourself. Yeah. And like we said, Ben Reich is clearly a psychotic. Something that I read in a couple of interviews and materials about Bester, and I think he says it as well in that Mid-American interview from the 70s, is that a plot that he comes back to a lot in his work is a man who's under a compulsion that he doesn't know or that he doesn't understand. And that is Reich to a T here. For most of the book, it's presented to the reader, and everybody thinks this. Powell and the rest of the police, and even Ben Reich himself presents this to himself. He's saying this to himself. It's all about economics. The DeCourtney cartel has got me on the ropes. It's a fight for survival. I've got to take out my business rival. But the real motive for his murder doesn't have anything to do with profit or money at all. It's that subconsciously Ben Reich either knows or has learned or somehow subconsciously feels and understands that Cray DeCourtney is his father, that DeCourtney and his mother had an affair, and DeCourtney just left it at that and never acknowledged him. So it's a crime of passion. He's laboring under this giant emotional weight that he doesn't understand because he can't see it. He gets peeped from time to time, and like some of the espers can see, like, whoa, you've got this like big emotional block that like you're completely blind to. You should maybe work on that. And he just goes, "What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about." There's a guy who has no face.
Men would rather commit the first murder in 70 years than go
exactly.
to therapy. Although he does go to therapy too.
Yeah, but so in light of all that, and I feel like it really works that he would get a code that says accept, and just be like, "That son of a bitch, he rejected me. I gotta kill him," because, you know, it's not about the money. He keeps making up these lies to himself and he doesn't even realize that he's doing it because he's just compelled by this weird death drive that, in a way, it's kind of like a Tiptree story. It's a character who's laboring under this weird compulsion that's like rewriting their code, but they have no idea that it's going on and that it's affecting their behavior. Because it's not just that he wants to kill the man that deep down he knows is his father. Like, he also really, really wants to get caught and punished for doing it.
Mm-hmm. It does present an interesting twist on the detective narrative, where Lincoln Powell has basically all the information from the beginning. There's a few bits and pieces that he doesn't quite understand. Like, he has to figure out that Reich used a water capsule instead of a bullet so that there was no evidence. But at one point, he is kind of stymied because he gets access to Ben Reich's like code chief, and he finds out about the messages, and it turns out that de Courtney accepted the merger offer, and he goes, well, shit, maybe he's not guilty because it doesn't make any sense. Why would he murder someone that he needs to have alive so that they can merge their companies together? And it is a neat like complication of the fact that Reich doesn't really know why he's doing what he's doing makes him a better murderer, because his motive doesn't really make sense to an outside observer until eventually Powell kind of realizes what's going on, that Reich is, among other things, also hiring hitmen to try to kill him himself, which is a neat touch.
Kurt, it's a reverse whodunit. It's you know, instead of like,
it's like Columbo, where he knows the murderer did it.
Yeah.
He's just got to figure out how to prove it.
Well, that's exactly what it is. Instead of, you know, a crime happening and, you know, the reader following the cop and like, gosh, who did it? What happened? Like, we know all the information from the outset, and, you know, it's just a matter of, is he going to catch the guy? I think it's I don't read that many mysteries, but like you said, it's an interesting reversal. The only like Poindexter-y type of nerd thing that it doesn't really bug me, but just like I feel like I have to point out, it is needlessly complicated, where in the plot, Bester goes out of his way to say that Ben Reich has ingeniously figured out a way to kill a guy with a gun with no bullet, you know, like the water gel cap. And they're like, oh, wow, it's so great. I guess Bester didn't know that blanks are very deadly. You know, certainly if you put a gun in somebody's mouth and then pull the trigger, it's a little explosion. It'll do just what's described in the book, but you don't need a water bullet. You can just kill somebody with a blank if you're close enough.
So I thought the reason for the water bullet was twofold. One, because yes, he buys the gun and he makes a big show of like, oh, you have to take all the bullets out, so you, person I'm buying this gun from, will see I don't have any bullets for the gun, wink, wink. But also because, unlike a blank, for instance, it wouldn't leave like a bullet or wadding or anything, because all it leaves behind is like this little gel tab, because the water is just water, so like it, you know, it gets swallowed or it goes away. I thought that was more the reason, less so than just like needing it to not use a bullet, which it still kind of leaves evidence. So I think, to an earlier point that Raquel made, I think it's just there because it's fun.
It is cool.
You know, it's like an ice bullet thing. Oh, what I was going to say earlier is there's this really odd sequence that I love a great deal, where Reich goes back to his like family vault and gets out these 5 envelopes that one of his ancestors left for him like hundreds of years earlier, with a bunch of plots to be used in an emergency. And we don't get to find out exactly what they are. Apart from that, they all seem like variations on like the perfect murder, although Reich does say that they're all pretty outdated. But it's accompanied by this letter that kind of is filled with this weird stuff about how to commit a murder. So it says stuff like, "Caution, the essence of murder never changes. In every era, it remains the conflict of the killer against society, with the victim as the prize. And the ABC of conflict with society remains constant. Be audacious, be brave, be confident, and you will not fail. Against these assets, society can have no defense." And I read that and I was like, this is some like Jordan Peterson, Mencius Moldbug, Peter Thiel shit. This is very much like the weird think brain mind genius stuff that rich guys imbibe to this day to tell them like, you are the master of reality. You must go out there and seize the world by the throat.
Yeah, Ben Reich's ancestor definitely had a bro podcast. He probably gave really questionable diet advice about how you shouldn't eat vegetables because vegetables are gay. Stuff like that.
It's very convincing.
There's
Yeah. Can't argue with that.
It's ABC.
I'm trying to think of like, there's just so much random stuff. Like one of the things that I like about pretty much any Bester novel, although in his later ones it kind of gets away from him a little bit, he just has weird ideas and just puts them on the page and is like, I'll just put this in here. Like for instance, there's a part where Lincoln Powell needs to calm down Ben Reich. Oh, that's a neat touch, is that in a very like Pacino, De Niro in Heat sort of thing, they have a couple of one-on-one meetings where Lincoln Powell knows that Ben Reich did it because he very briefly was able to like eavesdrop on his mind. Like not enough to get all the information, but enough to know that he did it. But Esper testimony is not admissible in computer court. I always love the thing where the cop and the criminal meet and are like kind of even like, we could have been friends under other circumstances, and they even say that to each other outright at one point. But there's a part where he has to give Ben Reich basically a drink to like calm his nerves, and he gives him whiskey capsules, which is a very 1950s like Jetson thing, which I love. It doesn't serve any purpose apart from like, in the future they'll eat future food.
Yeah, that was the era of like food pills. So we got whiskey pills too, you know.
Everybody is also using drugs all the time in this, is mentioned, which, yes, I love that. And also, I'm trying to think of, like, other random stuff. The Espers have some kind of, like, brain karate that they use on people, because there's a part where Lincoln Powell disables Ben Reich by, like, punching all of his pressure points. in a secret, like, karate way that, like, causes, like, a nerve block on him. It's very much, like... Again, there was a lot of that going around. Like, that's basically what the weirding way in Dune is also.
Yeah, there's so much fun, weird stuff in here. There's the space camping trip. I love how Powell uses a bunch of campers and tourists basically as a almost antenna for him. In that it's, like, weirdly manipulative, but also kind of clever.
It's so funny, though, like, when they're all espering to each other, and one of the espers is, like, some sort of interplanetary diplomat, and he's like, guys, what do you do when a tiger comes along? And somebody says, use diplomacy on it. It's a funny book.
It is.
Kurt, were you going to say something earlier about Tate and the Esper League of Patriots? I think we knocked you off course.
No, I think I more or less covered it. Was like the idea of the Espers as like the ascendant middle class. They're all like the careerist professionals in that they have power, but they're not really in charge. And as a result, they kind of band together, but they also band together in a very like selfish, exploitative way. So basically, the whole Esper Society Guild thing was taken in whole cloth, with acknowledgement, to be fair, for the TV series Babylon 5, which also has telepaths as like a big figure. The leader of the evil telepaths is named Alfred Bester in Babylon 5. Yes, and almost everything about the Telepath Guild is reused in Babylon 5, almost verbatim. The thing about, like, the eugenics program, although it's portrayed as much more, like, sinister and evil in Babylon 5, it's the same basic idea. The idea of if you break one of the rules, you'll be ostracized and, like, lose your mind because no other telepaths will talk to you. And I really wonder how much of our modern depiction of science fiction telepathy literally comes from here. Because there's so much of it that just... I've never tried to look and see what, if anything, Bester himself was drawing from, but a lot of these things feel like they just appear and reappear throughout subsequent science fiction. And I think just that in and of itself is like it's just a very influential depiction. And it's funny because we don't even really think that much of telepathy as being science fiction anymore. It's kind of become the realm of like weird conspiracy literature or just outright fantasy.
I think once the decades started to go by and telepathy never really panned out, it went from being, oh, science fiction that's just, somewhere for 10 to 30 years down the road to like, okay, this is just fantasy bullshit. It's never going to happen. Strike that one off the list.
Yeah, I mean, like in the 1950s, this was when the CIA was working on MK Ultra's super secret mind control experiments, and up until I think the 1970s, the U.S. government did have this special super secret like psychic training program to try to teach people how to do what that was called remote viewing in order to like spy on Soviet troops or spy on Soviet military bases. And it was all bullshit, of course, but they recruited a lot of spoon-bending Yuri Geller type motherfuckers to try and like get them to psychically spy on the Soviets during the Cold War. And there's a very cool Metal Gear character based on that premise. And it didn't pan out, but like there was legitimate government support for this idea of we're gonna try and do psychic shit. Let's make it happen.
Also, if you read a pulp magazine from the 50s, archive.org has a really good selection of 30s through 60s sci-fi and fantasy pulps. If you're ever, and I would highly recommend, if you're interested in that kind of literature, to go on there and like just look at how they were published and like what was published with them, because almost every single issue of that era of pulps will have multiple advertisements for some kind of like brain training program or like unlock the secrets of the human mind. It wasn't just in the stories. There were literal courses in all these pulps that you could, send away for and get our 10-week course in reading minds and manipulating others.
That was a huge part of Scientology, too, is that if you achieve operating Thetan level, whatever, you will be able to read minds.
Thank you for mentioning Scientology, because it reminded me of the very amusing Dianetics anecdote that I came across recently, where Alfred Bester worked off and on a few times, I believe, with notorious asshole, racist, far-right weirdo and misogynist John Campbell. Apparent misogynist John Campbell. It's the degree to which he was misogynist seems to be under debate, but the fact that he was seems not up for debate. So definitely bad, but is it like bad or really bad seems to be the part that's up for debate. So Alfred Bester sent a story to John Campbell, who I think at the time was it Astounding?
It was still Astounding. They didn't change the name, I think, until the late 50s, early 60s.
Okay, cool. So this must have been like the early to mid 50s. So Campbell asks him to come out and meet with him. And Bester shows up, and Campbell starts trying to tell him all about Dianetics and showing him all this like L. Ron Hubbard literature about how L. Ron Hubbard has solved war. He's solved all these problems. He's cracked the enigma of the human mind. And Bester is kind of like trying to humor him because A, he respected him as an editor, and B, he wanted to sell his story. And Campbell just keeps saying weirder and weirder stuff until it ends with Campbell accuses Bester of being unreceptive to the ideas of Dianetics because he has trauma related to, Campbell says, Bester's mother trying to abort him, and he starts yelling out, "The fetus remembers, Mr. Bester, the fetus remembers."
Wow.
According to Bester, of course. And it made me wonder whether part of the reason that Campbell thought was like, I gotta tell Alfred Bester all about Dianetics, is because Alfred Bester had written so much about psychology and telepathy in his own well-known writing. Like, I wonder if that made... I wonder if Campbell was like, this guy gets it.
I think it... Because I read that same hilarious anecdote to Kurt. I think it predates him writing The Demolished Man. I think it was just that the story that he sent to Campbell had some kind of Freudian overtones in it. And, Campbell said, like, Freud is dead. Dianetics has replaced it. Campbell's a funny guy. He kind of reminds me of Aaron Rodgers, the football quarterback, and, like other Joe Rogan, I do my own research types, in that he's like an intelligent guy, but like one of those intelligent guys who, like, because they're intelligent about one thing, they think they know everything about everything. And also, Campbell was really good at arguing, and he loved to argue, like, just as a pastime. It didn't really matter.
God.
It didn't really matter what the point was.
He
was just
goddamn insufferable.
Yeah, he was just an insufferable arguer. So, like, just the kind of guy who would just fall hook, line, and sinker for Dianetics, like he did.
Yeah.
But I would definitely buy that Bester's vision of telepaths is basically the basic template that we have for science fiction ever since then, since he was incredibly influential, much more influential than his rather comparatively small body of science fiction work would otherwise seem to attest. 2 master novels and a few dozen short stories, not counting his later post-1950s science fiction work.
He started trying to write almost like new wave type stuff. I read a little bit of it. I read about half of The Computer Connection. Very strange book, and it feels like Michael Moorcock in his super strange, I did a lot of drugs and wrote a story mode, which is surprising given that, like, you know, it seemed like he tried to keep up with the times in science fiction, which is kind of unusual for a man born in 1913.
Credit where credit's due, I guess.
Well, you can tell from his interviews, he was one of those writers who really loved science fiction, and he loved it for its imaginative possibilities. And, you know, definitely one of those guys who you see pop up every now and again, who are always decrying present state of science fiction, whatever present they happen to be in, because it's tired and nobody's really doing any good imaginative work or really trying very hard.
I don't know anybody like that or know what you're talking about.
I have no idea what
Stephen.
you're talking
I've never heard
about.
of such a thing.
Yeah.
I don't know this. I don't know her.
But as far as, like, the comparison between his earlier and his later work goes, I think you're right, Kurt. It is generally accepted that when he came back to the science fiction field after getting done with working for Holiday magazine, you know, just some of the old magic was lost. But in terms of novels, I have to wonder idly just how much the change from, you know, say, The Star's My Destination in '53 to the Computer Connection. I don't quite know when that was. Sometime in the mid-'70s, I think, right?
It's like 71, 72.
Yeah, I have to wonder how much of that was due to the loss of the influence of Galaxy magazine editor Horace L. Gold. Because something I knew that it was originally published in Galaxy, both Demolished Man and Stars My Destination. But what I didn't know before I started reading for this was just how much of an input Gold had into the writing of the book, so much so that some science fiction historians almost view it to be like a co-written novel, because apparently, you know, after Bester got done being harangued by Campbell, he never bothered to try and sell to him again. Apparently it was a very disappointing meeting, because, you know, he really looked up to Campbell because he had sold to him in the early 40s before he got involved in comics and radio and television. But so in the 50s, his main novel market was Galaxy magazine, and his Bester's main short story market was FNSF. And so it came about, Gold pursued Bester to write for him. Apparently, the genesis of The Demolished Man came from these long phone conversations that Bester and Gold would have regularly, like sometimes daily or at least weekly. They were in very close contact, and Bester had these 2 ideas. One about, you know, ESP, and he had another idea about writing a story about police who have time machines. And time travel would make crime impossible. So, you know, like, how could a clever criminal outwit time-traveling cops? And Gold suggested to him to combine those 2 ideas into one story. And Gold also thought that time travel was a worn-out idea, and suggested to him to use the ESP angle instead. So they talked about it a lot. And let's see. So one of the things that I took a quote from one of my notes. This came from Transformations, the story of the science fiction magazines from 1950 to 1970 by Mike Ashley. And he quotes Gold as saying, "For a year and a half, Alfie and I spent 4 hours a week on the telephone talking about The Demolished Man, and then he finally sat down and write it in less than 3 months. And, Gold had a notoriously heavy editorial hand. It's funny when you look back at like editors and their esteem in the field, for all that John W. Campbell was all the things that people says that he was, and he alienated a lot of his top writers, like Heinlein, for instance, with all of his heavy-handed crank ways. He was still very much loved in the field for what he did as an editor. But Gold, on the other hand, he edited Galaxy from 1950 to 1960, and then I think he died in 1980, and he wasn't hated in the field, but he's never been sung as many hymns of praise as Campbell was. And I think part of that just has to do that Campbell somewhat predates him, and also Campbell edited for a much longer time. But also because Gold, he had a bad reputation for sometimes changing authors' stories around, like rewriting large portions of them, changing paragraphs, editing without their knowledge, sometimes even changing endings to do what he thought would make a better story. And, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but, honestly, that would, get under a lot of writers' skins. But so anyway, and thankfully I'm actually remembering my train of thought for once. So even though that's all true, and so Gold wasn't very much as well liked, Bester spoke highly of him. In the Mid-American interview, Bester spoke highly of Gold, saying that Gold demanded perfection, and he demanded a lot of rewriting because Gold wanted the best story, and that was just something that worked for Bester. It might be a mark of professionalism, because Bester said that he was used to that style of editorial work from his days in television, where I guess rewriting is demanded a lot more on scripts. But so I wonder how much of the decline in Bester's late period could be attributed to the lack of influence from Gold, because Bester seemed to have had a very good and fruitful working relationship with him. Ooh, gosh, sorry. This is supposed to be about The Demolished Man, not about science fiction editors.
Everything you said aligns with what I've heard from him, even just talking about the writing and editing process in interviews. Because I think, again, in that Worldcon interview that we mentioned earlier, he talks about what does it take to write a story? And from his point of view, basically, first drafts are just shit. The goal is to just get things on the page. He talks about having been both a writer and an editor, and saying he understands why writers hate editors and vice versa, and it's because, as he explains it anyway, editors are trying to envision what they believe is the best possible story, and writers are trying to make the thing that they have written into the best possible thing, but it's not necessarily the same thing. And he even says, if I as a writer think I've nailed it, it's going to be instantly rejected. If I write something that I think is only okay, suddenly everyone's like, oh, this is amazing. And he's and it's kind of embarrassing because you still feel in your head that it's not. But he definitely seems to have much more of an editorial mindset, even about his own writing. He doesn't seem overly attached to it. About The Demolished Man, we should talk about how they catch Reich, or how they entrap him ultimately, and then, of course, what the mysterious demolition actually is.
Yeah.
I remember being agog at that ending when I first read it.
So how do they catch him? How do they catch him? How do they get him?
So the whole time they've been trying to find a few significant figures to help Powell prove to basically the judge computer. There's apparently a judge supercomputer that you feed all the facts of the case in, and it tells you if someone is guilty or innocent. And so they're trying to get all the facts together so that they can submit it to the computer and it will render its judgment. And what Powell does is he's finally able to probe Reich's mind, and he realizes... Well, so he does two things. One, he creates this hallucinatory world for Reich, where he gradually removes things from it. So first he takes away all the people, then he takes away all the trains and the buildings.
He takes away the stars.
The stars, yes. I loved that, where he looks up and just goes the stars are gone, and somebody who he'd been talking to goes, what stars?
What's a star? And he tries to look it up, and we don't have a definition for that word. That doesn't exist. He's like, oh, fuck.
It feels very much evocative of the description of a telepath losing their mind because they're all alone and have nobody that they can talk to. While this is going on, Powell is finally able to read his mind and realizes that he's not just a murderer, that he's actually a very unique type of megalomaniacal personality who won't stop until he's been able to remake the entire world, if not universe, to his own will. And so Powell basically says, like, if I'd realized what you were from the beginning, I would have just killed you myself. But he contacts all the other telepaths in New York City, and I forget, do you remember what the name of the thing is, either of you? I totally forget it. It's like a very, like, the Connexion Convergence or something like that.
Oh, mass cathexis?
Yes, that's it. Mass cathexis measure, which is, I guess that's how he harnesses all the telepaths together to create that fake reality. And then when he emerges from it, he immediately confesses. And he realizes that the man without a face is himself. He realizes that de Courtney is actually his father. And then he's taken into custody. And then the next thing that we see is, I believe it's Barbara de Courtney and Lincoln Powell are kind of hanging out at this, like, resort.
Kingston Hospital.
Oh, thank you. Yes, a hospital.
It's sort of a sanitarium, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Because it's very much like the thing from The Long Goodbye, the weird, shady, like, mental clinic / rich person retreat. So they encounter a naked, yelling Ben Reich, who basically falls on top of their balcony and is just, like, running around yelling and screaming. And what it is revealed to us is that demolition, the primary punishment, is basically annihilating your personality while retaining a lot of the fundamental inclinations. And the explanation is that future society recognizes that somebody who is able and willing to break the law and has that kind of personality is still an asset to society. They just need to be, like, remade in a way that makes them, use it for good instead of for harm. And so basically what's happened is that they have annihilated Ben Reich while leaving the raw material of Ben Reich in place. And much as Barbara de Courtney was remade to get out of her catatonia, they're remaking Ben Reich so that he won't be a psychopath while still, having all that drive and ambition and stick-to-itiveness or whatever it is.
They're reformatting his hard drive.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. To me, it's a very dark ending, and it's played off in, like, this very strange tone that I can't really tell what we, the reader, are meant to take away from it. It feels very dystopian, but it's not presented as if it's a downer ending.
Yeah, it's almost presented as, haha, isn't that funny?
Yeah.
He fell into some bushes.
This was the era of casual lobotomies, too, and it's
Yeah.
kind of weird to think about. All right, was that just kind of how people thought? Like, they just thought, oh, we can use science to kind of reset people. That's cool, and they hadn't yet experienced, like, what that actually means and how horrific it is to actually do that to a person.
Especially since the narration points out that one of the horrible things about demolition is that, as your mind is being erased, you, the person who's being erased, like, understand what is happening to you.
Yeah, like, it's presented in a way that is horrifying, and yet the characters are all like, finally, we'll have a nice new Ben Reich who'll contribute to society. And so, like, I genuinely don't know if it's meant to be haunting, if it's meant to be shocking. I kind of suspect that a big part of it is just going for shock value, because Bester seems to very much like doing a surprise reveal for its own sake. And it certainly is surprising. It was not what I was expecting.
Yeah, I was expecting some kind of weird future execution.
Yes. And it's almost worse, especially because, again, like, they encounter him naked and screaming at the hospital. It's not presented as a pleasant thing.
No,
so.
He's having a bad time, but then again, he's a real asshole, so I think we're supposed to just be like, haha, fuck that guy.
Yeah, and meanwhile, Lincoln Powell is like, and now to kiss this baby woman that I have decided to go out with.
Fortunately, she's a small % psychic, so I can marry her. I can do eugenics with her. It's great.
Oh, I forgot about... Yeah, you're right. I forgot
Yeah,
about
there's
that.
eugenics in this book, and everyone's kind of cool with it. Mm-hmm. There's psychic eugenics, because if you're a psychic, you gotta marry another psychic.
Well, you gotta make more psychics.
Babies. Yeah, you gotta make more psychic babies.
The forced marriage program, I do feel like gets a little bit of criticism, but not to the point where it feels like it is meant as a commentary. It's just that, like, a lot of the characters don't really like it either. Although, as you point out, once Lincoln Powell, like, finds a loophole, he's like, oh, okay. Well, that's fine now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not treated as that much of a human rights abuse, as more of an annoyance.
Well, it's, it's just a guild bylaw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They all got together and they had a meeting.
Yeah, you all gotta do eugenics. That's
Yeah.
the rule if you're an Esper.
I really wonder where the idea of, actually lawbreakers and murderers are a brilliant and exceptional part of society that we can't get rid of because they're the ones that have gumption, not like the sheeple, comes from. Because it's definitely something that pops up in a lot of science fiction stories and in that one Star Trek episode where Kurt gets split into his two halves. Have you guys ever seen that one where evil
Yes.
Kurt has the goatee?
Yeah, and good Kirk is just a whiny baby who can't do anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like, oh, we need you people, you assholes, and yeah, I guess it kind of works for what they want to do, but I always read it and think like, do we though?
Yeah, do we really need Ben Reich? Do we really need like a douchebag murderer with daddy issues?
Yeah.
I think that just comes from science fiction writers generally thinking that they're a cut above regular people. And Kurt, what you mentioned before about or maybe it was Raquel, talking about the Espers embodying middle class values opposed to the decadent, idle, immoral, wealthy. I think that definitely just comes, I think anyway, from Bester's upbringing, because he has said himself that he was that he grew up firmly middle class, and a writer back then was a sort of a middle class job, and he also graduated from University of Pennsylvania. So there you go.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
He
an Ivy.
did. He did, yeah. It's interesting to hear him talk about it because what he basically says is that he wasn't really good at any particular thing. He was like pretty good at a lot of stuff.
Right.
And so he just wound up kind of like wasting his time. But he's also fairly critical of his own education. He says repeatedly in multiple interviews, it's clearly like a favorite line of his, that after he went to college, it took him 10 years to unlearn all the dumb stuff that he learned in
Nice.
college to where he could start thinking actual thoughts again.
He seems
So-
to think that he was stuck up and a little too self-important about his own educational background.
Yeah.
It's a retelling of Oedipus.
I mean, there's a lot of Oedipus shit going on in here.
That's true.
There's a lot of olden times, 20th century Freudian psychoanalysis in here. And it's great.
There's a lot of like vague incest stuff as well because Barbara de Courtenay is his half-sister at least, and when she's introduced, she's like running around mostly nude in like a see-through dress, which Reich is sure to comment upon.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff going on that is definitely Oedipal.
There's a lot going on in this book.
And also, this isn't my thought. I read it in the Starmont Reader's Guide on Alfred Bester by Carolyn Wendell. But she points out that the ending is a reverse Oedipus, because instead of a mother marrying her son, we have in Lincoln and Barbara de Courtenay, spiritually at least, a father marrying his daughter.
God. That whole subplot. Jesus
I
Christ.
love the love subplot. It is so bonkers. I've never read a love subplot like that before. I mean, I know there's weirder stuff out there that I could read. I've heard of Flowers in the Attic, but in a science fiction book, man, what a bonkers love plot that is. It is so weird.
It is. All right, so we've been talking for a good bit over an hour. Why don't we wind down? Final thoughts?
I think it's not a perfect novel by any sense. There's a lot that you can criticize about it if you want to start like making a list. Like, I think that the prose isn't Bester's finest. I think The Star's My Destination came out like 3 or 4 years later, and I think that the prose writing is like noticeably better in that. There's quite a bit of ableism. There's like an evil albino character, for instance. There's disability isn't really reflected in an especially positive light. Gender roles are not great.
Yeah.
But like, I think it's one of those books where Carl Sagan described it as a book that was like so fun and engaging that it just kind of like gets you before you really have a time to think too hard about it.
Yep.
And that like, if you were to sit and think about it, you'd be like, oh, well, this is kind of bad, and this is kind of bad, and this doesn't make sense. But there's just something about how it's written that just works on a moment by moment level, if nothing else. And I think that ultimately for me is what the book lives and dies by. Not the complexity of the mystery, not the quality of the prose. It's just a fun, fast novel. And it gets you, and you go and you pop out the other side and go, huh, that stuff with the adult baby was weird, but the harmonic gun was cool.
The harmonic gun ruled. That was cool. Completely nonsensical weapon. It makes no sense. I don't give a shit. Floor's
I
lava.
love that. I just love that it makes the one guy's head explode. And they're like, and I think the one telepath is like even like reading his mind when his head blows up. But yeah, it's not a perfect novel, but it is a fun novel, and I will always take a fun novel.
Yeah, it's fun in a way that's actually fun, not like Kaiju Preservation Society, for example, which is not fun.
Don't know
and
what
wants
you're
to
talking
pretend
about.
to be fun. No one had fun writing that.
Never heard of it.
Never.
Doesn't exist.
It's not real. It can't hurt you. But yeah, this is a really terrifically fun, pulpy, kind of silly book. And I found the 1950s datedness of it actually really charming.
Yeah, it's good. It's a lot of fun. I forget if I said this on camera or off camera now, but when I read it the first time a few years ago, it took me 4 days to read it, and this time around I was worried that it was going to take me like 2 weeks because, I've got a toddler, there's just a lot of stuff going on at home, and somehow 4 days, same amount of time. It's so much fun, and even though there are places in its particulars that you can criticize, I feel like the bigger stuff behind it, its propulsiveness, the competence, and the flair of the prose, even though it's not his best work, it's still good, and it keeps you moving right along. Just how compressed everything is, but it doesn't feel underbaked or half done, and it feels very rich. Bester's really great at building and conveying character through action. Gordon told me that he learned that from his time writing in the comics, so that it's a very slim book, but it feels jam-packed not only with ideas but also with story and character, and it's just so well done, and just done in ways that I feel like a lot of current SFF writers they don't know how to do. They don't know how to write this well, this concisely. They don't know how to write this professionally anymore. Somebody could write this book today, but I feel like it would be 3 times longer and generally not as good. So that's just my thought on the book. I like it a lot. It's very old, and it has its 50s old-timiness to it, but it's also feels incredibly current for today.
Yeah.
Just as one last fun little anecdote, something that I came across when I was researching this, when he was working at Holiday magazine, he was on staff as an editor because he published an article on sharks. It was a good article, but he said to the author, I'm going to give you a kick in the ass. What you've written here is really the start of a novel, and you got to go write that novel. And the author was Peter Benchley, and the book that he pushed him to write was Jaws.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Bester, we view him from, the science fictional angle, but that was really just a very small part of his life. Like, he worked in real entertainment, and when he was doing features and interviews for Holiday, like, he interviewed a lot of real capital A celebrities. He was on the very first flight of the Boeing 747. He interviewed Sophia Loren, Laurence Olivier, Elizabeth Taylor, and a lot of people. I would be interested in. I'd never actually get around to doing this, but if I ever saw like an issue of Holiday magazine, like just in some rummage sale somewhere, I would look at that and see if I could find if it had one of his interviews or his articles in it, because interesting guy.
I want to look up his reviews, because I'm pretty sure that Bester wrote a review column for a few years for FNSF.
Yes, you're right, he did. I think from 60 to 62.
I'm really curious to look that up. I may do so.
Ooh, I must have a few of those. I'm going to look at those up later. Oh, my God. Oh, actually, Kurt, you know what else I can do? The Starmont Guide, it's got a bibliography in the back. I can, take a picture of his... it's got a bibliography of his book reviews. So I can send that to you.
Well, I appreciate
Yes,
that.
it lists the
But
issues.
let's hand it back to Raquel.
Oh, yeah, right.
Before
Sorry.
we start chatting.
All right.
Do you guys want to go for another half hour?
Yeah. I gotta do things. I gotta feed my cats. They're starting to give me that look. Hold on, it's their treat time. Okay. Well, thank you both very much for coming on the show, and thank you all for listening and supporting us. Be sure to check out our Discord if you haven't already. And until next time, keep reading and keep writing good.
This has been Rite Gud with Raquel S. Benedict, hosted by Raquel S. Benedict and produced by Matt Keeley for KS Media LLC. Theme song by OK Glass. For comments and concerns, please write to us at ritegud@kittysneezes.com. That is RITEGUD@kittysneezes.com. If you'd like to support us, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/ritegud. This has been a Kitty Sneezes production.
Kitty sneezes.